Next Sunday is 40 days after Easter. I know that's how you mark your calendars. That's how everybody marks their calendars. It's 40 days after Easter next Sunday, meaning that is the day marking the ascension of Jesus to heaven. I'll address that more next week, but for today, that means that this word of encouragement from John 14 is our last message from Jesus before the ascension on this topic of how to keep going in his absence. For several weeks now, we have looked at multiple texts just like this one, in which Jesus is doing everything he can to prepare his disciples for life after ascension. Not wanting to leave them unprepared, Jesus is offering them hope, support, and direction for the coming days when he's just not there with them face to face anymore. And certainly these are not the only things that Jesus said to the disciples to prepare them. John is very clear that he did not have enough room to record everything Jesus said and did. But passages like this one represents, they're a sampling of the many things Jesus said and did to prepare the disciples for his absence. Something that we are too keenly aware of. If we were to sit down and make some Venn diagrams of what we have in common with the disciples, which might sound like something you've never done or never would do, but some of us do that all the time. If you were to sit down and make some Venn diagrams of what we have in common with the disciples, we would notice that not only are we both followers of Jesus, that we're people who make mistakes, that it's people who sometimes have doubts, but that we also share in the middle there this experience of life after ascension. That might seem like a useless observation, but it isn't. Yes, the disciples had time with Jesus face to face, and I think we can all agree that that is profoundly unique and encouraging. It's an experience that we would all love to have had. But they did also know life without Jesus being there in person, just like us. And that not only makes the disciples more relatable, but it also means that stories like this one are uniquely directed at our commonality with the disciples. Sometimes we wiggle out of what Jesus said by remembering that what he said was just for them back then and not for us right now. Like that time that Jesus rebuked James and John because they wanted to call down fire on the Gentiles. We would never do that. And Jesus would never have to rebuke us like that. That was just for them. That has nothing to do with me, and I will go to lunch free and clear of that rebuke. But there's also that time that they were all on the boat, and there was a storm. All those disciples were on that boat, and they were scared, and they didn't trust Jesus. But if we were on the boat, surely Jesus wouldn't have to critique our lack of faith because we would have been snoozing below deck with him. It is easy and it is tempting to play these kind of what-if scenarios with some of the gospel stories. All because we bank on the supposition that if we could be face-to-face with Jesus, then we could do things different, if not better. Maybe not. We'll never know. What we do know, however, is just like the disciples after the ascension, we wake up every day in the same boat, believing in Jesus, though we cannot see him. So it is especially important for us to pay attention to a text like this one. Not only because it is valuable wisdom from Jesus, but because it does speak directly to our shared situation with the disciples, life after ascension. So with eyes to see and with ears to hear, let us turn our hearts toward God in this passage and allow ourselves to be encouraged to live each day with a confidence of faith. Now, as is often the case with Jesus, especially Jesus in John's gospel, there's a string of connected, dependent statements that create this chain of logic. Nobody likes sentence mapping, and I'm not suggesting that we do any of that this morning, but I do think it would be helpful for us to break down what Jesus is saying into some sort of sequence of events to help us better process the profound nature of what he is saying. First up, Jesus, knowing he is leaving soon, tells the disciples to love him. And loving him means keeping his words, which he points out are actually God's words. That's the God who sent him to speak those words. Next, in case they forget the words or they don't understand them when he's not there to explain it to them and spoon feed it to them, Jesus will send another, the Holy Spirit, to teach and remind them of what Jesus said, of the words he gave, the words which were not his words, but the words that were God's words, the God who sent him so that they could love him, which should bring a peace of mind and a peace of heart as they live out their lives in the faith that though Jesus is gone, he will return. And that's it in the simplest form. Those are the components here. These are the working parts of what he's trying to tell them. That's the encouragement Jesus offers the disciples in this text. Generally speaking, that first bit and that last bit makes sense. We would all agree, I think, easily and without need for much clarification, that loving Jesus is intricately tied up in adherence to his teachings. Not that you earn his love by doing the things he said. It's not like that, but there is a connection. Something between correlation and causation, I think. And we would likely similarly agree that loving Jesus and living by his teachings should bring us some comfort and peace and hope until his return. I don't think any of us are here because following Jesus makes us miserable, and that sounds like fun. I think we're here because of this peace business and the hope and the forgiveness and all those good things, not something else. So I don't think we're going to have a problem with number 1 or number 3 here. It's that middle bit that throws us for a loop. That part in the middle is what often confuses everything. We just don't have a good track record with the Holy Spirit. We hear the words Jesus says here, and we believe it, but push come to shove, where rubber meets road, we are often left confused and frankly uncomfortable when Jesus starts talking like this, which is when our defense mechanisms kick in. The first one of which is we start to think that maybe this Holy Spirit thing is one of those times Jesus was just talking to them back then and not me right now. Which is why I went to all that trouble a few minutes ago to point out how this passage is definitely for them and for you. It's not one of those times where you can say that's just for the disciples. This is for you. It's for me. It's for all of us. Everybody in between and everybody yet to come. It's a timeless passage. This passage about the Holy Spirit and all the passages about the Holy Spirit are especially for us, because we too are living in that in-between time between the first incarnation and the second coming. And you can try to wiggle out of that. Many have, but there is no denying that what Jesus has to say about the Holy Spirit here in John 14 is as true for you today as it was for the disciples then. So when that doesn't work, we move on to the argument that we just aren't the charismatic type. Sure, some Christians out there are really into this Holy Spirit stuff, but that's just not who we are. And so we very politely file John 14 away with somebody else and say that's still not for me, which also isn't true. I don't think any of you want me to make you sit here in the heat and listen to a very long, detailed history of our own movement, but I can briefly at least point out that Barton Stone of Stone Campbell was very much the charismatic type and would make all of you so uncomfortable. Barton Stone was the charismatic type who went to revivals where people barked and walked around trees and fell over and fainted and screamed and hollered and did all the charismatic things that you try not to talk about or think about. He was one of us. And many of us throughout the years after have been very charismatic. That is part of our roots. That is part of who we are. We don't talk about it. We certainly don't try to recognize it. And we certainly don't bring that usually to worship, but it's there. It is technically part of who we are. To say that we're not charismatic, to say you're not charismatic in many senses is to say that you don't have the Holy Spirit. And I don't think any of you want to go that far. You just can't wiggle out of this one. We are a Spirit-filled people. We do believe and recognize the Holy Spirit as existing, and not only existing, but existing here, or as Jesus would say in John 14, that the Holy Spirit has made a home for God and Jesus and the Spirit within us and with us. So unless any of you are willing to commit the heresy of saying that you don't recognize the Holy Spirit at all, we have to do something with this. You have to admit that this text is for you. This word is for you. This is one of the words that we keep because we love Jesus, not one of the words we ignore because it's not actually about us. Not just the disciples back then and not just for some other Christians, but for us. So what do we do with it? Well, let's make that a little easier. Your role here is simply to accept and believe that Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit are doing everything within their power to help you live out your faith with confidence. That's all that's being asked of you here. In fact, the only thing Jesus is expecting of you in this passage is to pay attention when the Spirit teaches and reminds you of what Jesus said. Not because there's a test, but so that you can live by his words in love of him. And maybe that sounds overly mystical and mysterious and some other word that starts with M that means the same thing. But at its core, this passage is reminding us that Jesus sent the Holy Spirit to help us, and not just with our problems, but to help us more deeply love and follow Christ. I don't see anything wrong with that. The trick is, you see, it's all in the name. Jesus here is using a really cool word to name the Holy Spirit, not in the sense of like a surname or anything like that, but as a bit of an identifier. The word that Jesus uses here is paraclete. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, what you do need to know about this word is what it means, which is a whole bunch of really neat things. Paraclete is a great word for a lawyer. Paraclete is a wonderful word for counselor, advocate. But it also means someone who guides and directs, a navigator. Paraclete also means someone who comforts. Paraclete means friendship. Paraclete is a word that implies directly a deep sense of connectedness and understanding. For the Holy Spirit to be advocate, to be paraclete, is to be comfort, is to be guidance, is to be counsel, is to be help. Some English translations will often call this word helper. That's what the Holy Spirit is, and what the Holy Spirit is offering us as we try to live our lives for Jesus. You see, he's trying to tell us that we have not been left alone to navigate this world by ourselves. You have a navigator for that. We've been given the paraclete to help us along the way. And as a result, our lives are different. To say it the way that Jesus did, that means that we have a peace that prevents our hearts from being troubled and afraid. Please notice that Jesus gives three things in this passage. Three things that freely: his word, the Holy Spirit, and peace. And those three things are not unrelated. Each builds on the others. The Holy Spirit teaches and reminds us of the word so that we can have peace in our lives. That is what it means to be charismatic people. I don't think any of you would like to not be charismatic in that sense of the word, in the truest sense of the word. To be a people filled with the Spirit is to be a people filled with peace. And that's a gift that doesn't go away. It's a gift that is not dependent upon your circumstances. It's not something fleeting that comes and goes and comes and goes. This isn't some sort of strange algorithm or sinus wave. This isn't anything but solid, steady, reliable peace through this Spirit. Because if you truly understand what it means to be filled with the Spirit, to have the Paraclete with you at all times, then you have comfort at all times. You have counsel when you need it. You have help and friendship and partnership and companionship. You have advocacy. You have everything you need to work your way through this life with peace, with a trouble-free heart, with a mind not weighed down with worry. As Jesus prepares to leave, to ascend into heaven, he doesn't just tell them what they need to hear, he gives them everything they could ever need. The very presence of God through the Holy Spirit in their lives. How could anyone give peace like that? He wouldn't even need to explain that it's different or unique if we truly understood what he was giving. As he's preparing to leave, as these disciples start to feel alone, the truth of this passage, the truth of the role of the Holy Spirit here, the thing that sounds so mysterious is simply that you are not alone. In fact, as Jesus prepares to ascend, he says, God is going to be closer now than ever before. You might be losing out on me, but you're getting something so much more. And it's hard to think of something more than Jesus. But it's what we have. It's what the Holy Spirit is. It's who we are as a spirit people. I keep saying that we're spirit people because you have two options here. In terms of Greek, you have two options. You are a pneumatic people, which can either mean that you are pneumatic as in the sense of your hydraulics on your car, or you are pneumatic in the sense of you are spirit. When the Gospels say spirit, they weren't talking about pneumatic systems in your car. They weren't talking about hydraulics. They were talking about spirit. You are spirit. It's who you are. You are charismatic. You have the Spirit. So don't feel so alone, even though you are. Don't feel so defeated when you can't make the evil of the world stop. Don't feel so overwhelmed whenever you can't breathe from your anxiety. Because you have been filled with the very presence of God. And they can take everything else, but they won't take that. When we come to this table, we do a lot of things. In particular this week, though the sample is small, I hope you feel filled. I hope from our worship, though it be hot, that you can walk away feeling filled with hope and goodness and peace. This might be one of those sermons where I don't tell you the thing that you're doing wrong and the thing you got to fix, but I think that's low-hanging fruit. Instead, this is the sermon where I tell you that you can have peace in your life. Not peace like the world gives, but the real thing that can only come from the presence of Christ. And if that's something you're missing, if that's something you've forgotten, if that's something you feel like you've lost along the way, reclaim it, not by doing anything, but by allowing God to work in your life and fill you with that Spirit. If only we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear the things that God is doing in and around us. And if that's something you want more information about or help with, as usual, the elders will be at the back, and they're more than happy to pray with you and to help us in any way they possibly can. They really do want to be there for you. Take advantage of that, and let us together be a Spirit people, reclaiming what it is to be charismatic and leaving here with a peace that perhaps we didn't walk in here with this morning.